Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, let me begin by asking a simple but urgent question. How do we explain a crisis that has captured the world's attention, one that has left thousands dead, millions displaced, and an entire region in flames? Was this eruption of violence and despair inevitable, or was it made worse, even deliberately intensified, by political decisions taken in Washington? The truth, uncomfortable as it may be, is that the policies of Donald Trump directly fueled the Gaza crisis. And unless we confront that reality, we will fail to understand not only Gaza today, but the dangerous trajectory of U.S. foreign policy more broadly. Trump came into office with a very clear approach to the Middle East: throw out decades of even the pretense of neutrality and align the United States more aggressively with one side of the conflict. He moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, a symbolic gesture that told Palestinians, and indeed much of the Arab world, that Washington no longer had any interest in even pretending to be a fair broker of peace. This decision, cheered on by his base and a handful of powerful lobbyists, was not about diplomacy. It was about politics, about securing domestic support at the expense of regional stability. That was the first spark that set the region on a new course of confrontation. But it did not end there. Trump slashed aid to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the organization that supports millions of Palestinian refugees who have been trapped in camps for generations. By cutting off that lifeline, he didn't just save the U.S. Treasury a few dollars. He guaranteed that already desperate families would sink deeper into poverty, fueling the kind of hopelessness that makes peace impossible. And remember, hopeless people do not simply disappear. Their anger, their frustration, their sense of betrayal all become combustible materials in a conflict already overflowing with fuel. Consider to the so-called Abraham Accords. Trump's team touted these deals as historic peace agreements, but they were not about peace for Palestinians. They were about bypassing Palestinians altogether, normalizing relations between Israel and Arab regimes while leaving the core issue unresolved. It was a clever short-term diplomatic stunt, but in reality, it isolated Palestinians even further, making them feel abandoned not just by the U.S., but by regional neighbors who once at least gave lip service to their struggle. That sense of abandonment, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the deepest wounds feeding today's crisis. Now, some will say, but Professor Wolff, every American president has been biased in favor of Israel, so what makes Trump so different? The answer is blunt. Trump ripped away the mask. Where earlier administrations maintained a rhetoric of balance, even as their policies tilted one way, Trump flaunted the bias openly, loudly, proudly. By doing so, he removed any space for negotiation, any illusion that Washington could be trusted by both sides. That left Palestinians with nothing but despair, Israel with a sense of carte blanche, and the entire region primed for the explosion we are now witnessing. And let me emphasize, this is not about personalities alone. Trump, in many ways, was the symptom of a larger disease: the capture of U.S. foreign policy by corporate interests, by the arms industry that profits from endless wars, and by political opportunists who treat human lives as bargaining chips in their domestic power games. The Gaza crisis is not just about Gaza. It is about what happens when great powers play cynical games with human suffering, when empathy is replaced by arrogance, and when justice is abandoned in favor of political calculation. When we analyze the decision to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, we have to ask ourselves, what does such a move symbolize, and why did it provoke such outrage across the Middle East and the wider world? On the surface, it may seem like a matter of geography, a simple relocation of an office building from one city to another. But in reality, this was not a neutral administrative decision. It was a deeply political act, one that carried enormous symbolic weight. For Palestinians, for much of the Arab and Muslim world, Jerusalem is not simply a city. It is a spiritual, cultural, and historical center. by unilaterally declaring Jerusalem the capital of Israel through this embassy move. The Trump administration was effectively saying to Palestinians, your claim to this city, your heritage, and your aspirations for a shared future here no longer matter now. Let us be clear. For decades, U.S. administrations had deliberately avoided such a move. Why? Because even though Washington was never truly neutral in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, at least there was an effort to maintain the appearance of neutrality. That appearance mattered. It gave Palestinians some reason, however thin, to believe that the U.S. could act as a mediator, that peace negotiations, however fragile, still had a chance. Trump tore away that facade. He declared openly and unequivocally that Washington stood entirely with one side. Imagine trying to negotiate a settlement when the referee has already walked across the field and joined one team. What chance is there for fairness? What chance is there for peace? The embassy move was celebrated by Trump's political base at home and by his allies abroad, but the cost was borne in Gaza. Within hours of the announcement, protests erupted, and within days, violence followed. We saw Palestinians risking their lives to demonstrate against what they perceived, rightly, as the erasure of their history and rights. The symbolism of Jerusalem cuts to the core of Palestinian identity. Denying them that, through this act of political theater, was like pouring gasoline on a fire already raging. And here's the hook: Trump knew it would provoke such a reaction. His advisors warned of unrest. His intelligence agencies predicted upheaval. Yet he proceeded anyway. Why? Because this was never about peace. It was about politics, domestic politics in the United States. By aligning so brazenly with Israel on Jerusalem, Trump secured support from powerful lobbying groups, evangelical Christian constituencies, and segments of the Republican Party that had long pushed for this recognition. The decision was less about the Middle East and more about consolidating his base at home. That is the tragedy of it. The lives of Palestinians and Israelis were put at risk so that Trump could score points in Washington. This is a recurring theme in U.S. foreign policy, decisions made not with the goal of long-term stability, but for short-term political gain. We must also consider how this decision reshaped the regional landscape. Arab governments, already struggling with internal pressures, were placed in an impossible position. Public opinion in their countries was overwhelmingly against the move, yet many of these governments are reliant on U.S. support. They were forced to either condemn the decision and risk Washington's displeasure, or remain silent and face backlash from their own people. This created new fractures across the Middle East, weakening any potential for a unified Arab response to the crisis in Gaza. In effect, Trump's embassy move did not just alienate Palestinians, it destabilized the broader region. And let's not forget the global consequences. The United Nations voted overwhelmingly to reject the U.S. decision. Traditional American allies from Europe to Asia distanced themselves. Washington's credibility as a mediator in international conflicts suffered a serious blow. If the U.S. could so recklessly disregard decades of international consensus on Jerusalem, why should anyone trust its word on other disputes? The embassy move was not just about the Middle East. It sent a message worldwide that the United States was willing to abandon international law and global norms whenever it suited domestic political needs. That is a dangerous precedent, one whose ripple effects extend far beyond Gaza. Think about the timing as well. The embassy was inaugurated on the very same day that dozens of Palestinians were killed in protests along the Gaza border. That juxtaposition, celebrations in Jerusalem attended by American officials while blood was shed in Gaza, was more than symbolic. It revealed the chasm between rhetoric and reality. It showed the world that the United States could smile, wave flags, and declare success while ignoring the suffering unfolding just a few miles away. That image, seared into the minds of millions, became a rallying point for anger and resentment. When we ask, why did Gaza erupt? Why did tensions rise to such a boiling point? We must return to this decision. The embassy move was not a small gesture, it was a seismic shift, one that removed the last shred of Palestinian trust in American diplomacy. It was the moment when the mask came off and Palestinians saw, in the clearest possible terms, that the U.S. was no longer pretending to be a mediator. It was an active participant aligned with their occupier. That realization, my friends, is what fueled the fury in Gaza, and it is a fury that continues to reverberate across the region today. When we examine the consequences of Donald Trump's decision to cut aid to Palestinians, particularly his targeting of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, we are forced to confront not just a budgetary adjustment, but a devastating act of political sabotage. For millions of Palestinians, especially those trapped in Gaza, that aid was not a luxury. It was survival. It meant food for children, schools that kept young people off the streets, medical clinics that treated the sick when hospitals had already collapsed under blockade. By cutting that funding, the Trump administration didn't simply shift policy. It pulled the rug out from under a people already standing on the thinnest edge of despair. And here's the question that should haunt us. What happens when you take hope away from those who already have nothing left to lose? The answer is visible in Gaza today. The Trump administration justified its aid cuts by claiming that Palestinians had to be pressured into negotiations, that reducing their support systems would somehow make them more willing to compromise. But this was not negotiation. It was coercion. It was collective punishment disguised as diplomacy, and it backfired catastrophically. Instead of producing compromise, it deepened resentment. Instead of moderating behavior, it pushed people to extremes. History shows us time and again that when a community feels abandoned by the world, when it sees its children go hungry and its future stolen, it does not bow down quietly. It resists. Sometimes that resistance takes peaceful forms, sometimes violent ones, but in every case, the cycle of instability grows. To understand the cruelty of these cuts, consider the numbers. UNRWA serves around 5 million registered Palestinian refugees in Gaza alone. Roughly 80% of the population depends on some form of humanitarian aid. By eliminating hundreds of millions in U.S. contributions, Trump essentially crippled the very agency designed to provide relief in one of the world's most volatile regions. Imagine a city where almost every household depends on food assistance and suddenly the main supplier withdraws. What do you think happens the next day? Do people shrug and accept their fate? Or do they erupt with anger, seeing their children cry out in hunger? This was not just predictable, it was inevitable. And the cruelty lies also in the timing. Gaza was already strangled by blockade, unemployment was soaring, and infrastructure was collapsing. Hospitals were running out of electricity, clean water was a luxury, and youth unemployment hovered around 60%. In that fragile environment, aid was not an add-on, it was the thin thread holding society together. Trump cut it and the thread snapped. That decision was less about saving money and more about sending a message that Palestinian rights, their suffering, and even their survival were negotiable chips in a political game. Why would a U.S. president pursue such a path? Here's the uncomfortable hook, because for Trump, cruelty was not a byproduct, it was the point. By dismantling aid, he signaled to Israel's government and to his domestic allies that Washington would no longer tolerate what they derided as Palestinian dependency. It played well with segments of his political base, who viewed Palestinians not as people deserving of compassion, but as obstacles to an agenda rooted in religious prophecy or strategic alignment. Aid was cast not as humanitarian necessity, but as a handout to the undeserving. And this framing was not accidental. It was designed to shift the conversation from justice to punishment, from negotiation to surrender. The consequences were profound beyond Gaza as well. Across the region, Arab populations watched as America starved Palestinian refugees of basic support. Even governments that had begun normalizing relations with Israel faced fury from their people. Images of Palestinian children struggling without schools, without food, without medicine spread widely. And what story did those images tell? That the United States was not a partner in peace, but enabler of suffering. That narrative fueled anti-American sentiment across the Middle East, undermining Washington's credibility not just in Gaza, but in every regional conflict. We must also recognize the ripple effect. When the U.S. withdrew funding, other donors were pressured to fill the gap, but most could not fully cover the shortfall. UNRWA cut jobs, reduced services, and shut down programs. That meant thousands of Palestinian teachers, doctors, and aid workers suddenly lost their livelihoods. It meant classrooms grew overcrowded, clinics turned patients away, and families that once scraped by fell deeper into poverty. Each one of those losses was a spark, adding fuel to the already combustible situation in Gaza. And sparks, as history teaches us, don't simply vanish, they ignite. When we think about Trump's cuts to Palestinian aid, let's stop imagining it as a budget line on a spreadsheet and start seeing it for what it truly was, a calculated political strike on the most vulnerable, a policy that transformed deprivation into desperation. And once desperation takes root, it does not stay confined to the camps of Gaza. It spreads, it destabilizes, it breeds conflict that crosses borders. What Trump created was not leverage for peace, but conditions for war, and we are all now witnessing the consequences. When the Trump administration unveiled the Abraham Accords, the announcement was wrapped in the language of peace. We were told this was a historic breakthrough, a visionary deal that would bring harmony to a fractured Middle East. The signing ceremonies were full of handshakes, smiles, and lofty speeches about a new era of cooperation. But if we strip away the glittering stagecraft and examine what these agreements actually accomplished, a very different picture emerges. The accords were not about peace for Palestinians. They were about bypassing Palestinians altogether, silencing their voices, and normalizing their marginalization in the international arena. That is the hook we must grapple with. Peace was the headline, but abandonment was the reality. For decades, the Palestinian struggle was at the heart of Middle Eastern politics. Even governments that were quietly aligned with the United States and Israel still felt compelled to at least publicly declare support for Palestinian rights. The Abraham Accords changed that equation. They gave Arab governments a green light to formalize relations with Israel without securing any meaningful concessions for Palestinians. In doing so, they signaled to Palestinians that their cause was no longer central, no longer even a bargaining chip in the negotiations between regional powers. Imagine being told for generations that your liberation depended on solidarity from your neighbors, only to watch those neighbors shake hands with the very government that occupies your land, all while you remain behind barbed wire and checkpoints. This was not peace, it was a strategic alliance dressed in the costume of peace. The Trump administration sold the accords as a breakthrough because they desperately needed a foreign policy victory. But what was being celebrated in Washington and Tel Aviv was perceived as betrayal in Gaza and the West Bank. Palestinians saw Arab leaders applauding agreements that did nothing to end occupation, nothing to halt settlement expansion, nothing to ease the blockade strangling Gaza. Instead, they saw economic deals, arms sales, and diplomatic recognition flowing freely while their lives grew only more restricted. Is it any wonder that the accords fueled rage rather than reconciliation? The danger of this approach lies in the illusion it created. By calling these deals peace, the Trump administration attempted to redefine peace itself, not as justice, not as reconciliation between conflicting peoples, but as transactional normalization between governments. That redefinition strips peace of its moral foundation. Peace without justice is not peace. It is the maintenance of inequality under a different banner. And here is the sharpest hook. When you redefine peace in such hollow terms, you set the stage for greater conflict, because those who are excluded will not quietly accept their erasure. They will resist, and their resistance will grow fiercer precisely because they feel abandoned. The Abraham Accords also reshaped the balance of power in the region by drawing countries like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and later Morocco into closer alignment with Israel. The Accords created a new bloc united not by a commitment to resolving the Palestinian question, but by shared economic and military interests. American weapons flowed more freely, business partnerships expanded, and intelligence networks grew stronger. But what about the people in Gaza living under bombardment? What about the families in the West Bank facing home demolitions? They were written out of the script. Their suffering became background noise to the grand performance of so-called diplomacy. And when human beings are reduced to background noise, history shows us they will find ways to be heard, often explosively. We must also consider the psychological impact of the Accords. For Palestinians, the sense of betrayal ran deep. It was not just that Arab governments abandoned them, it was that they did so publicly with fanfare, in a way that suggested Palestinian suffering was no longer even inconvenient enough to hide. That humiliation stings as deeply as the physical hardships of blockade and occupation. Humiliation is a powerful political force. It festers, it accumulates, and it drives people to actions that might otherwise have seemed unthinkable. When leaders sign treaties that erase the oppressed, they are not paving the road to peace. They are paving the road to the next uprising. And here lies the irony. The Abraham Accords were touted as a means to stabilize the Middle East, yet by excluding Palestinians, they destabilized it further. They created a world in which Palestinians felt cornered, where peaceful negotiation seemed futile, where the only options left appeared to be surrender or escalation. History teaches us that when people are pushed into that kind of corner, escalation is the more likely path. Trump's so-called peace deals, rather than extinguishing the flames of conflict, poured accelerant onto them, ensuring that the Gaza crisis we see today was not only foreseeable, but inevitable. One of the most striking features of Donald Trump's Middle East policy was not simply its direction, but its tone. Previous U.S. administrations, whether Democratic or Republican, all tilted in favor of Israel. That is a historical fact. But they wrapped that tilt in the language of balance. They spoke of the need for two states, of the importance of negotiations, of America's role as an honest broker. The reality rarely matched the rhetoric, but at least the rhetoric left room for dialogue, left space for Palestinians to believe that someday Washington might lean toward fairness. Trump shattered that illusion. He tore off the mask and declared, loudly and without hesitation, that America stood entirely with Israel. That open bias changed everything, not just in diplomatic halls, but on the ground in Gaza. And here's the crucial hook. When you strip away even the pretense of neutrality, you remove the last incentive for the oppressed to believe in the system. What fills that void is anger, despair, and resistance. Think about the impact of words and symbols in politics. When an American president says without qualification that Jerusalem is Israel's undivided capital, that settlements are not illegal, that Israel has the right to defend itself without ever mentioning the rights of Palestinians to live in dignity, those are not neutral statements. They are declarations of alignment. They tell Palestinians that their side of the story, their pain, their history, simply does not matter in Washington. And when a superpower dismisses your humanity in such public terms, what message does that send? It tells you that negotiation is futile, that appeals to fairness are wasted breath. That realization pushes people away from diplomacy and toward confrontation. The Trump administration did not just shift policy, it normalized extremism by legitimizing the most hardline positions of the Israeli government. Under Trump, U.S. officials openly praised settlement expansion. They cut off even symbolic criticisms of Israeli military actions. They reframed the debate so that Palestinians were not a people with legitimate claims, but obstacles to an agenda of regional realignment. This wasn't subtle. It was deliberate, and its consequences were immediate. Israeli leaders, emboldened by unconditional U.S. support, accelerated settlement building and tightened restrictions on Palestinians. At the same time, Palestinians saw that their suffering was no longer even acknowledged, much less addressed, by Washington. Consider the psychological weight of that realization. For decades, Palestinians had been told to wait, to negotiate, to compromise, because eventually the United States would deliver justice. With Trump, that promise was exposed as hollow. Instead of being treated as potential partners in peace, Palestinians were treated as a problem to be managed, an inconvenience to be bypassed. That is not diplomacy, that is dismissal. And when entire populations are dismissed, they do not disappear. They react, they resist. The Gaza crisis we see today is, in part, the direct result of that open dismissal. But Trump's bias did more than inflame Palestinian frustration. It also poisoned the international stage. Other countries, watching Washington abandon neutrality, lost confidence in America's ability to mediate conflicts anywhere. If the U.S. could be so brazenly one-sided in one of the world's longest-running conflicts, why should anyone expect fairness in other disputes? America's credibility suffered a blow, not just in the Middle East, but globally. And credibility is not a trivial asset. Once lost, it is hard to regain. That loss of trust has long-term consequences for U.S. influence far beyond the borders of Israel and Palestine. Here is where the hook becomes sharper. By embracing open bias, Trump did not create peace for Israelis either. He created the illusion of safety while sowing the seeds of greater danger. When Palestinians lose faith in diplomacy, violence becomes more likely, and when violence erupts, Israelis are also at risk. True security cannot be built on the suffering of others. Yet Trump's policies encourage precisely that illusion, that one side could have peace without justice for the other. History has shown again and again that such illusions collapse under the weight of reality. The tragedy is that open bias masqueraded as strength. Trump and his supporters framed it as courage, as finally telling the truth. But the truth is that by discarding even the appearance of fairness, the United States helped lock the conflict into a more dangerous cycle. It left moderates voiceless, empowered extremists, and stripped away any framework for dialogue. What remains after such a policy is not stability, but volatility. And volatility, especially in a place as combustible as Gaza, is a recipe for catastrophe. One of the most damaging legacies of Donald Trump's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the way it empowered extremism on both sides. In politics, words and policies don't exist in a vacuum. They ripple outward, shaping the calculations of leaders, communities, and movements. When Trump abandoned even the pretense of balance, when he embraced the most hardline policies of the Israeli right and cut off all meaningful channels for Palestinian representation, he sent a message that moderation had no place at the table. And here's the critical hook: when moderation is sidelined, it is extremism that thrives. Consider what Trump's unqualified support meant for Israeli politics. For years, there had been debates within Israel about the future of settlements, about the possibilities of negotiation, about the risks of indefinite occupation. Those debates were not always balanced, but they existed. With Trump in power, suddenly the Israeli right wing, including leaders who openly rejected the idea of a Palestinian state, felt emboldened. They were given a blank check by Washington, a signal that no matter how far they pushed, the United States would back them. Settlement expansion accelerated, military operations grew harsher, and rhetoric shifted further to the right. When a superpower removes all constraints, it emboldens those most willing to exploit that freedom. Now look at the Palestinian side. Trump's policies gutted the moderate Palestinian leadership by cutting off aid, by recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, by bypassing Palestinians in the Abraham Accords. He undermined the credibility of those who had argued for negotiation and diplomacy. Leaders in Ramallah, who had spent decades trying to work within the international system, suddenly looked powerless, irrelevant, even complicit. Ordinary Palestinians ask themselves, if dialogue achieves nothing, if diplomacy brings no results, then why follow those who preach patience and compromise? That vacuum of credibility is precisely where extremist groups gain strength. They present themselves as the only ones willing to resist, the only ones not humiliated, the only ones willing to answer betrayal with defiance. And that is the vicious cycle Trump accelerated. Israeli hardliners, emboldened by unconditional American backing, adopted policies that deepened Palestinian suffering. That suffering weakened moderates and strengthened extremists in Gaza and beyond. Those extremists, in turn, escalated resistance, often violently, which then gave Israeli hardliners justification for further crackdowns. Back and forth the cycle goes, each side pointing to the other's extremism as proof of their own righteousness, while ordinary people on both sides pay the price in blood and despair. This is not abstract political theory. It is the lived reality of families in Gaza who lose their homes, of communities in southern Israel who live under constant fear, and of children growing up knowing nothing but hostility and siege. What is particularly dangerous is the way Trump framed this cycle as a form of strength. He sold the idea that siding fully with Israel would bring stability, that by crushing Palestinian resistance, peace could somehow emerge. But peace built on exclusion is an illusion, and illusions cannot hold forever. Instead, what Trump's policies created was a breeding ground for radicalism. When people are told their voices don't matter, they don't become quieter, they become louder. When they are shown that peaceful paths lead nowhere, they don't stop walking, they take a different, often more dangerous road. The hook here is sharp and undeniable. Policies that claim to guarantee security actually made everyone less secure. We must also note that extremism thrives on symbolism. When Palestinians saw American officials celebrating the opening of the embassy in Jerusalem while protesters in Gaza were being killed, those images did not fade. They circulated, they lingered, and they became proof, in the eyes of many, that the international system had abandoned them. Extremist voices seized on those images as recruitment tools, as rallying cries, as evidence that only resistance could preserve dignity. And on the Israeli side, every rocket or violent act from Gaza was used by right-wing leaders to rally support for even harsher policies, creating a feedback loop where extremists validate each other across the divide. We have to face this hard truth. Trump's policies did not just fail to contain extremism, they legitimized it. They gave extremists the very conditions they need to grow: humiliation, hopelessness, fear, and the collapse of trust in diplomacy. And once extremism takes root, it spreads quickly, crossing borders, shaping generations, and ensuring that conflict does not end but perpetuates itself. Trump thought he was projecting strength. What he was really projecting was permission for the most dangerous actors to take center stage, pushing peace further out of reach than it had been in decades. When we step back from the day-to-day headlines about Gaza, about bombings and protests, about ceasefires that never last, we begin to see a larger picture. The crisis is not just about two peoples locked in conflict. It is about the way great powers conduct themselves, the way domestic politics in Washington can shape the fate of millions of lives thousands of miles away. Donald Trump's policies toward Gaza were extreme, yes, but they were also part of a broader pattern, one in which U.S. foreign policy has been repeatedly captured by narrow interests, short-term calculations, and the enormous weight of corporate and military power. That, my friends, is the deeper lesson. Gaza is not an exception. It is a warning. And the hook that should stop us in our tracks is this: the same logic that fuels endless war abroad eventually comes home to undermine democracy and stability here as well. Look carefully at what happened under Trump. His decisions regarding Israel and Palestine were not guided by a deep concern for peace or justice. They were shaped by domestic political calculations, the desire to please evangelical voters, to reward lobbying groups with immense influence in Washington, and to hand his administration a foreign policy victory that could be packaged and sold to his base. That calculation is not unique to Trump. It has been the currency of U.S. foreign policy for decades. But Trump's bluntness made it impossible to ignore. He stripped away the diplomatic language and showed us the raw mechanics of how decisions are made, who gets a seat at the table and who is pushed into the shadows. And the reality is that the voices shaping policy are rarely those of the people who suffer its consequences. In Gaza, it is ordinary families who pay the price for decisions made in air-conditioned offices in Washington. The aid cuts, the embassy move, the Abraham Accords, none of these policies were designed with Palestinian well-being in mind. They were designed to serve power, to serve image, to serve profit. And here is where the arms industry enters the picture. Every escalation, every rocket fired, every airstrike conducted feeds into a cycle of weapons sales and military contracts. Companies profit when wars intensify, and their influence in Washington ensures that the cycle keeps turning. In that sense, Gaza is not just a geopolitical issue. It is an economic system at work, one that rewards conflict instead of resolution. Now, ask yourselves what happens when a society grows accustomed to waging endless wars abroad. What happens when resources are poured into sustaining militarism rather than building healthcare, education, and infrastructure at home? The answer is already visible in the United States. Crumbling schools, widening inequality, unaffordable housing, these are the domestic echoes of the same policies that fueled destruction in Gaza. The hook here is powerful. The bombs that fall in Gaza are linked to the budget cuts that close clinics in American cities. They are two sides of the same coin, and ignoring that connection allows the system to continue unchallenged. Trump's policies toward Gaza revealed how quickly justice can be sacrificed for political gain. They showed us how human suffering can be leveraged as a bargaining chip in domestic battles. But they also exposed something even more troubling, that many Americans, distracted by the packaging of patriotism and power, do not see how these policies boomerang back into their own lives. When the U.S. normalizes open bias abroad, it creates a precedent for bias at home. When it dismisses the voices of the oppressed overseas, it lays the groundwork for dismissing marginalized voices domestically. The culture of arrogance, of prioritizing power over people, does not stay contained. It spreads. And this is why Gaza matters far beyond Gaza. It is a mirror. It reflects the moral compromises of a foreign policy driven by short-term advantage and corporate interest. It reveals the costs of allowing militarism to dominate our politics. And it asks us a difficult but necessary question: if we continue down this path, how long before the instability we export becomes the instability we live with every day? That is not a distant hypothetical. It is a trajectory already unfolding, and unless confronted, it will shape the future, not just of Palestinians and Israelis, but of Americans as well. Trump's policies did not invent this trajectory, but they accelerated it, dramatized it, and made it visible to anyone willing to look. The lesson is stark. The Gaza crisis is not simply a tragedy happening over there. It is a signal flare, warning us about what happens when foreign policy is reduced to spectacle, when profit replaces principle, when the oppressed are ignored until their anger explodes. Ignoring that lesson is not just dangerous for Gaza, it is dangerous for all of us. So, where does this leave us? It leaves us with a painful truth. The Gaza crisis was not inevitable. It was fueled, accelerated, and intensified by policies consciously pursued under Donald Trump. But here's the real hook. the sobering lesson we must take away. If we fail to hold leaders accountable for policies that produce devastation abroad, those same policies will eventually produce devastation at home. The cycle of violence, militarism, and economic exploitation knows no borders. The seeds planted in Gaza today will bear fruit tomorrow in ways that will shock even those who think they are immune. My friends, let us end with this. To speak about Gaza is not to speak about some faraway land of perpetual conflict. It is to speak about ourselves, about the values we claim to uphold, about the kind of world we are creating for the next generation. Trump's policies lit a fire, yes, but whether that fire consumes us all, or whether it becomes the catalyst for a movement demanding peace, justice, and genuine diplomacy, that, my friends, is still up to us. Thank you.